Okay, well, welcome. Glad you could turn up for this presentation today. We invite you to take one of the pamphlets on the table there to see what's coming up. Got a number of good presentations coming. Next month, we hear from Professor Catherine Schiffendecker from Luther Seminary. We'll be talking about creation care and what the book of Job says towards the end of the book about God's love of the cosmos that he created. So that'll be a good talk next month. Today we're delighted to have Professor Sarah Rubel from Gustavus Adolphus to speak on Christianity and politics in America today. It's timely, I think, and something we watch anxiously as it plays out in the halls of government. At Gustavus, she currently teaches religion in America, Christian theologies, evil, sin, and suffering, and losing my religion.
Losing my religion.
Here's Sarah Rubel.
Great. Thank you. It's good to be here today. Losing My Religion, I should say, is a first-term seminar class, and it's about religious skepticism, and it's based, the title's from an REM song that students' parents know about and students do not. Which is a lot like all of my jokes now. I constantly, I'm referencing The Princess Bride, and I just get so then I have to explain that if they want to understand any of my jokes, they probably need to go watch 1980s movies and perhaps Parks and Recreation, and that's what I've got. So today I'm going to talk about American Christians and politics and the question, how did we get here? And we may have different views of where here is, so I'll, in a few slides, explain what I mean by that. I am a religious historian and not a political scientist, so maybe that's important. So when you bring me in, what you get is a lot of talk about the past, and then I sort of wave my hand and say, and then the political science will, people will tell you about the present and the future. So we're going to talk about the past. And what I have a thesis, kind of an argument of the presentation today, is that over the 20th and 21st centuries, religious Americans, and I'm going to focus today on American Christians, although we see this play out in some other religious traditions, not quite in the same way, sorted themselves into partisanly aligned groups of conservatives and liberals, owing to interrelated issues including race, the power of the federal government, gender, and visions of what it means for a country to be godly. So we're looking at what we talk about now as polarization and how that happened and what issues drove it. But in order to help us think a little bit about this question, where we are, I want to start with a couple of slides. These are two maps, one from 1918, of something in 1918, not from 1918, and then from 2012, showing the results from the House of Representative elections. Okay, so we have our reds and blues. Okay, so just looking at this map, what changed from 1918 to 2012? Anyone notice anything?
Conservatives took over the South.
Okay. I will say Republicans took over the South. Okay. Yes, we have a huge shift from a solidly Democratic South to a relatively solid Republican South. And then you'll notice the coasts change a little bit. Okay. So part of what we need to explain is how this happened. Okay. And what this means for our current kind of sense of polarization. One way to think of this is that the story of the 20th century is that both parties became national. In the early part of the 20th century, the Republican Party was in some ways not a national party in the sense that it had no voting constituency. It had constituency in the South, but Black people could not vote in the South. So it really was not able to be in the South. Okay. What we now have are two national parties. The other chart here, and this is very hard to see, and so my apologies, is a chart from, I believe, again, 2012, but it's kind of the same, showing the voting patterns of different religious people here specifically, but not only Christians. And so we start at the top with Mormons, who are highly Republican. The Church of the Nazarene, an evangelical group, the Southern Baptist Convention, American Evangelicals, right? You all know that when I say evangelicals, I don't mean you people who are evangelical Lutherans. Lutherans are weird. We love you. You're great. You have wonderful colleges. Also, you use evangelical in a way that's more German than, okay. I won't go through the whole thing then. Constantly having to put that thing in. Assemblies of God, Evangelical, Presbyterian Church in America, which is the evangelical branch of the Presbyterian Church. Evangelical. Then you get down to the American Baptist churches, the Presbyterian Church USA, which is different from the Presbyterian Church in America. Could they have come up with two church names that were more similar? No. The Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, where you get much more of a split. And then you go down to the very bottom, and right below the Unitarian Universalists, you have the National Baptist Convention, which is an African American denomination. And you can see things going from highly Republican to highly Democrat, right? What's interesting when you get down to the bottom there is the three bottom groups, the Church of God in Christ, the Unitarian Universalists, and the Baptist Convention, National Baptist Convention. Two of those three are predominantly African American churches, and they're not theologically liberal. They're theologically, in some ways, somewhat conservative on social issues, including, particularly on LGBTQ issues, but highly, highly democratic in terms of political alignment. So this is part of what we're trying to explain. Okay? The other thing I want you to keep in the back of your heads is, and again, sorry for American History 101, Abraham Lincoln was what party? Right. So when we're doing all of this, right, when you think about that first map in the Democratic Party, remember that the Democrats haven't always been liberal. Southern Democrats were not liberals. And Republicans weren't always conservatives. There are a lot of Northern Republicans that were moderates and even sometimes kind of liberals on certain issues. Okay? So we're talking about a real sea shift. One way we talk about that is to say that over the course of the 20th and 21st centuries, we've had two related, what we call realignments, people grouping themselves in new ways. One is political and one is religious. So the religious realignment is this. Identification as a liberal or a conservative has become more significant for most, particularly Protestant Americans, than denominational identity. So if you are a liberal Lutheran, you probably have more in common theologically and politically with a liberal Presbyterian than you do with someone who's Wisconsin Synod. Right? And that denominational identity has become less and less kind of the central thing. There has also been then a political realignment. The solid white Democratic South becomes solidly Republican, and the Republican Party has become more Southern, not necessarily in geography, although somewhat in that, but also in sensibility. So these two things have happened over the course of the 20th and 21st centuries. Does this make sense? Now we want to explain why. All right. So we're going to go back to the 1920s as kind of one kind of demarcation point. You have to start a history lesson somewhere. I'm choosing here. That is an arbitrary choice. We could have chosen differently, but I find people get a little bit scared if I start things in 1612. So we're going to start in 1920. Okay? The story starts earlier, but this is where I'm starting. With a pivotal moment in American religious history called the Scopes Trial, right? This is the famous trial about teaching evolution in public schools in Dayton, Tennessee. It's fascinating. If you're looking for a good book to read that's history but is accessible, I highly recommend the book Summer of the Gods, or Summer for the Gods, I can never remember the preposition, by Edward Larson. This trial is great. If for no other reason than the town fathers of Dayton created the situation where it would happen in their town because they wanted tourism. John Scopes probably never, well, was a PE teacher, possibly never taught biology. Great trial. Anyway, but what's key for us in the Scopes trial, if we're taking this as a moment in time, after the Scopes trial, as part of the Scopes trial, we begin to see a set of issues that are going to play out over the course of the 20th century, having to do with issues that we still talk about. Expertise. What is the role of the expert in American society? Particularly the role of the expert when it comes to things like what your children learn in school. Who should get to decide that? The teachers? Professors? Taxpayers? That's all kind of circling around at the Scopes trial. There's also something that starts being talked about at the Scopes trial in a really robust sort of way, which are religious conservatives talking about the concern of the establishment of atheism. The establishment of atheism. Now, what I mean by that is when we talk about an establishment, that's First Amendment language. There shall be no establishment of religion. We still argue about what that means. They were arguing about it when they wrote it. We continue to argue about it. But what in the Scopes trial conservatives begin to say is, if you teach evolution in public schools, that is not a neutral position. You are establishing atheism as the de facto religion because the logic was evolution is atheist. If you teach atheism in public schools, you're supporting atheism with public money. You have therefore established atheism. Okay? Follow? Good. All right. So, and we're going to see this play out again and again. However, after Scopes, what seems to a lot of observers to happen is that the Scopes trial demolishes conservative Christianity as a political movement. That's the thought for a lot of people, particularly a lot of liberal Christians after Scopes. John Scopes actually lost the trial, but the court of public opinion says religious conservatives were made to look stupid, and they will cease to be active participants in any significant way in American culture. The culture belongs to more liberal forms of Christianity. These people are dinosaurs, they're gonna die out. Okay? That was the thought for a lot of kind of, again, more liberal Christians, liberal people in the United States after Scopes. Boy, were they wrong, but that's what they thought. All right, so what happens, right? How do you get from these people are dinosaurs to, oh my gosh, they're not? Well, I'll get to my slide here in a sec. Some of you may remember that or may think, right, what happened was the religious right in the 1970s, right? There was all this talk in the 1970s, and then particularly with the election in 1980 of Ronald Reagan, that what happened, according to a lot of people, was there were religious conservatives in the 1920s. They kind of vanished for 60 years, and then they woke up right around the passage of Roe, decided to get politically active, and then they elected Ronald Reagan, right? That's a story that got told. It was like, oh my gosh, these people still exist. They always existed. What happened, though, is that there was activity over all of those decades. It just wasn't clear to a lot of people. And what wasn't happening yet, but we're going to now trace, is how do all white conservatives become Republicans? That's the change. It's not conservatives being involved in politics. It's not religious conservatives being involved in politics. The change is white conservatives coalescing around one party. So let's look at how that happens. They don't go away. They just take a while to coalesce. All right. Another book. I do like this book a lot. It is much thicker and the print is much smaller than Summer of the Gods. So if you're going to look for, a good history book that's easy to read, Summer of the Gods first. From Bible Belt to Sun Belt, also very good. But again, you got to do a little wading through some small print and lots of footnotes. But the argument of this book that I think is pretty well accepted now is that one of the things that happens in the 1930s and 40s has to do with reactions in the South to the New Deal, and then the migration of Southerners to the Sun Belt, to Arizona and particularly California. So here we go. Here's the story. In the 1930s, a lot of white Southerners supported the New Deal. They needed the New Deal. And part of the compromise of the New Deal was that its programs supported poor white people in ways that they tended not to support poor black people. So there were a lot of compromises made around the New Deal to get the support of Southern Democrats, who we call Dixiecrats, okay, so that they would sign on. But they wouldn't sign on if support in the New Deal was equal for African Americans and white Americans. Okay? So a lot of white Southerners supported the New Deal as a necessary intervention in a time of economic crisis. Some of those folks, not all of them, but a not insignificant number of them, then in the 1940s move to Arizona and California to start working in the expanding military industrial industries around air flight and all of those things that come out of World War II and then the beginnings of the Cold War. Okay? And they come to particularly California as Democrats. They've always been Democrats because who was a Republican? Lincoln. And even maybe more to the point, Sherman. So they're Democrats. But they come to California, and the California Democratic Party is different than the, say, Texas Democratic Party. The California Democratic Party, to paint with incredibly broad brushstrokes, doesn't see the New Deal as a one-time intervention in an economic crisis. The California Democratic Party sees the New Deal as a new way of the government interacting with the economy, that they want to be permanent. They want the government to be more involved in the economy. They want a stronger social safety net. And some of them, at least, want it not to be discriminatory by race. So when some of these Dixiecrats encounter a new Democratic Party, they think, oh, this is not what we meant. This isn't what it meant to be a Democrat in Texas and Alabama, right? This is different. And they begin to migrate into the Republican Party. And as they migrate into the Republican Party, they also change the Republican Party in California, making it more libertarian and in many ways more conservative. And they begin to have significant success in California, helping elect people like Governor Ronald Reagan. So they're beginning, right, to change Republican politics, but then they're also still connected to Democrats in the South and are sort of saying, hey, you know what? You know who may not be so bad? The Republicans. Oops, sorry, we already did the Scopes trial. Hold on to that, okay? That's happening. One thing that's happening. But the other thing that's happening in the 1950s is the illusion of religious and political unity. It is an illusion. But we were just talking about this, right? This is this moment in American culture where a lot of people thought that everybody agreed on some things, particularly on a robust sense of religiosity related to the Cold War, right? This is where there is time, and Billy Graham is perhaps one of the best examples of this, but there are others like Bishop Fulton Sheen, who was on TV in the 1950s, who are now explicitly linking being godly Americans versus those atheist communists. That being religious becomes part of being American. And there is a concerted effort to tie together democracy, free enterprise, and religion. That to be religious is to be pro-democracy, and economically pro-free enterprise, particularly a more kind of laissez-faire, not a lot of government involvement kind of enterprise. There are things that happened in the 1950s, like inserting the under God into the Pledge of Allegiance. That's an insertion in the 1950s to really emphasize the sense that to be a good American, to be anti-communist, is to be part of your American identity, is to be religious. They're all together. This is a time where a famous sociologist named Will Herberg wrote a classic book called Protestant Catholic Jew, in which he's claimed, it seems to me that a realistic appraisal of the values, ideas, and behavior of the American people leads to the conclusion that Americans, by and large, do have their common religion. And that religion is the system familiarly known as the American way of life. So what Herberg argues is that you in America, you can be Catholic. That's kind of become okay by the 1950s. You can be Jewish. That's kind of become okay by the 1950s. You can be Protestant. Those have all become acceptable ways of being American. Maybe not quite equally acceptable, but acceptable. What you have to be is committed to this idea called the American way of life. Now, to be clear, Herberg doesn't think this is good. He thinks this is a real problem for religion. Because he says basically what's happened to Protestants, Catholics, and Jews is they've given up, particularly in their white parts of the Protestant tradition, any kind of ability to criticize the American way of life in order to be accepted as good Americans. Right? That's what religions have traded. Right? Some kind of real robust critique in order to be good, godly Americans. I do want to note there are still internal, particularly Protestant divisions in the 1950s. I said the unity is apparent, right? There's still kind of a Protestant, what we call mainline today, and what we're going to call evangelical Protestants. That's clear in the 1950s. But there's at least, for a lot of folks, this sense that they might be kind of part of the same project. Maybe. Billy Graham is at least willing to say that from time to time. He thinks mainline Protestants are theologically wrong, but if they're willing to be part of his crusades, that's what he calls them, okay. We're all part of this American project. So there's a little bit of perhaps feel-goodism going on in the 1950s. And then the 1960s happen. Right? We're still trying to explain. I know some of you are like, what are we trying to explain again? We're trying to explain how the Republican Party became a national party that conservatives coalesced around. Okay? So hold the 1950s in your head. We all feel good. We like each other. Yay. There's a civil rights movement going on, and people will think about that in just a second. But there's this kind of facade of unity. All right. So the 1960s happen. And key in that is the civil rights movement. And the questions the civil rights movement raises about the country. This is going to be something that becomes a touchstone in terms of what happens politically in kind of complicated ways. All right. And one of the key things that happens in the civil rights movement is a question that King and others raise about what's the story of America, right? The story of the 1950s America, for white people, is like, we're the godly country that's fighting the communists. It's a pretty nice story. Like, we're the good guys. What the civil rights movement does is to press on that and say, sure about that? And this is one of those moments where I think people forget how critical Martin Luther King Jr. could be of America. So this is a quote from him from one of his books, Why We Can't Wait. This is what he says. Our nation was born in genocide when it embraced the doctrine that the original American, the Indian, was an inferior race. Even before there were large numbers of Negroes on our shores, the scar of racial hatred had already disfigured colonial society. From the 16th century forward, blood flowed in battles over racial supremacy. We are perhaps the only nation which tried as a matter of national policy to wipe out its indigenous population. Moreover, we elevated that tragic experience into a noble crusade. Indeed, even today, we have not permitted ourselves to reject or to feel remorse for this shameful episode. Our literature, our films, our drama, our folklore all exalt it. It's a pretty trenchant critique of the country and the founding of the country. And this is something that the civil rights movement was kind of pushing. Who are we really? We see, or we say we are? It also raised questions about Christianity. What's Christianity about? Individual salvation, close, tight-knit communities, liberation, and are these mutually exclusive? This is a woman named Fannie Lou Hamer, who you may or may not know, who was a very devout Christian and a voting rights organizer in Mississippi, who was horribly beaten for trying to organize voters in the 1960s in Mississippi, and then went to the Democratic National Convention in '64 as part of a biracial delegate group that Mississippi had not chosen, but it asked to be seated as the actual representatives from Mississippi. This angered Lyndon B. Johnson to no end. But that's another story, although it's fascinating. But what's happening here, again, note, is we've gone from the 1950s, where it's kind of like, yes, again, Christianity's good and it helps the country, to people saying, okay, but is it? Or are all forms of Christianity really doing that? There are Christians in the South, but also in the North, that are fighting school integration. Places like Milwaukee, where the idea of integrating public schools was really no more popular than it was in Alabama. And what a lot of those good Christian people are saying is, these are our schools. These are our neighborhoods. We don't want other people moving in, and other people was code. So there's all this kind of angst around what is the story of America, what's the story of Christianity. All right, still explaining religious realignment, so here's where we're going to really now talk about the rise of what's called the religious right. The religious right really begins to form as all of this is happening. And there are multiple kinds of catalyzing events around the formation of the religious right. And I'm just going to tell you right now that historians continue to argue about the relative importance of these things I'm going to talk about. Meaning they argue about what really most catalyzes the religious right. And it's not a simple question, and it's also a pretty weighted question. Because some of these things as catalyzers of the religious right are, if you're part of the religious right, much nicer stories to tell about yourself than others. Okay? I think they all are important in the story, and I think probably for different parts of the religious right, they play differently. So I'm going to talk about all of them. So why did these people coalesce? That's what, we're trying to explain. Against the backdrop of the civil rights, against the backdrop of what's happening in 1940s with the political parties beginning to shift a little bit, what happens? Well, one is back to that concern of atheism, which they're now going to call secular humanism. And this is a concern spurred by the 1960s Supreme Court's decisions around school prayer and Bible reading. So again, there are conservatives who, when the Supreme Court says that you can't mandate school prayer or Bible reading, say what the Supreme Court has done is to mandate secular humanism as the default religion. Now, I'm sure some of you are sitting there going, no, this is about religious neutrality, right? You can't force somebody to pray. For a lot of these religious conservatives, the assumption is that religious neutrality does not exist. This is, I think, a really key point in trying to understand the logic. Their logic is essentially this. You either acknowledge the existence of God, or you say God doesn't exist. Those are your options. There's no kind of place where it's like, well, God might exist, but we're not really going to talk about God. Like, if there's a God and there's a space where you're not talking about that God, that's atheism. How could you have a space if there's a real God out there? Like, there's no place where that God isn't. And if you pretend that there is a place where that God isn't, that's not neutrality. That's actually taking a stand. That's the logic. You don't have to buy it, but that's the logic. So what they're saying here is that the government is now endorsing, forcing secular humanism, which is the new way they talk about atheism. But it's the same thing. The idea that secular humanism means humans are the center of everything. There is no God. We get to make up the rules and we get to do whatever we want. That's one piece of the puzzle. Next piece. The growing power of the federal government, going back to the New Deal and the Civil Rights Movement. What the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and then specifically the Civil Rights Movement taught religious conservatives is the federal government was not going to leave them alone. People at the time could remember a period where the federal government didn't really intrude much on your life. There was a time before everybody had a social security number. There was a time before federal income tax. Like, the federal government delivered your mail. That's how you interacted with the federal government. But after the New Deal, and then even more specifically after the Civil Rights Movement, when the federal government goes into the South and says, if you do not desegregate, we will do it for you. Kind of. I mean, they don't really, but like there's moments where it seems like they might. That teaches a lot of, again, white Southerners that the federal government is not going to simply leave them alone. So they have a choice. They can either let the federal government, which they now understand to be a secular humanist government, do what it wants to them, or they can make a really concerted effort to have significant control in the federal government and make sure the federal government's doing what they want it to do. Okay? So there's increased federal government control. And then we get into race. Again, this is, as historians talk about the rise of the religious right, the most contentious piece. People who are part of the religious right want to say that this is not the catalyst for the rise of the religious right. People who don't like the religious right absolutely want to say it's the catalyst for the rise of the religious right. I think we have to say that it plays a role. Okay? So here's what we're going to say. I'm going to actually go back to 1960. In 1960, Jackie Robinson campaigned in the presidential election. Do you know who he campaigned for? 1960? He did. He campaigned for Richard Nixon. Okay? And a significant number of African Americans, I want to say 30 to 40%, voted for Richard Nixon in 1960. By 1968, that percentage had gone away. What happens? The election of 1964, when Barry Goldwater runs on a Republican ticket as, again, this kind of new libertarian Republican who, among other things, is advocating for states' rights. Now, there's a whole discussion to be had about states' rights, but clearly in American history, by and large, when African Americans hear the word states' rights, they don't hear good things, for understandable historical reasons. So this is a moment where you have LBJ, who's running as somebody who supports the civil rights movement, at least fairly consistently, against Barry Goldwater, the Republican, who's for states' rights. This doesn't completely turn the South Republican, but it's the first election in which there is a significant proportion of the white South that votes for a Republican. And it's the moment we begin to see African Americans leaving the Republican parties in huge numbers. It is a change. Then the other thing that happens is in the early 1970s, the IRS under Nixon, so this isn't necessarily partisan at this point, under Nixon starts going to private schools, The big name here is Bob Jones University, which had been a segregated, did not allow black students, and then had rules against interracial dating when they did allow black students, and says you either have non-discriminatory policies or we're removing your tax exemption. This is clearly, for some leaders in the religious right, a key moment of coming together and deciding to form a political movement. That is, I think, historically clear, that there are leaders in the religious right who see this as a key moment. They think the federal government is going to start going after religious institutions. Now, how they frame this varies, and how historians talk about it varies. Is the concern that we don't get to be racist, so we're going to try and take over the federal government, because that's one way of telling the story? Or is the concern that the federal government is stamping on religious freedom, because that's another way of telling the story, right? Okay. And then, of course, people argue about whether religious freedom is just a way to disguise your racism, which is another way to tell the story. But clearly, there is a coalescing happening here. We're going to try and work together to make sure the federal government does not do these kinds of things. All right. And then finally, gender. I'm running out of time, but I do really want to show you this, and then we'll kind of start wrapping up. This is a flyer from Lynchburg Christian Academy, which is now known as Liberty University. The university started by Jerry Falwell, who is one of the architects of the religious right. This is the private school that he started before Liberty University was founded. This is a pamphlet from Lynchburg Christian Academy called 5 Things We Think You Will Like About Lynchburg Academy. And I think it tells us a lot about what is catalyzing at least some members of the religious right. You won't really be able to see it, so I'm going to read it to you. 5 things you'll like. There's a quality education. Great. 2, there is no drug problem at Lynchburg Christian Academy. Although they are kind of honest here, they do say that that is not to say that no LCA student has ever used drug. No school could make that statement in total honesty. So they're hedging a little bit, but we don't have a widespread drug problem. 3, Bible reading and prayer are legal at Lynchburg Christian Academy, going back to the secular humanism. 4, we have no hippies. Right? But then note how they talk about this. Neatness of appearance, proper length of hairs for boys, and right attitude toward elders are all part of our curriculum. Right? Hold on that hair thing. And then 5, our students are taught to love America. So all that questioning the civil rights movement's raised, we don't know. Our country is good. Not the hippies, but the other people. Then also, so I love this, but you can't read it, so I'm going to read it for you. There are other things you will like also. We teach respect for parents. You can tell our boys from our girls without a medical examination. They weren't kidding about the hair length thing. All of which is to say, another catalyzing issue has to do with gender, particularly about abortion. This, again, is a contested topic. Historians debate a lot about the actual role of abortion in the formation of the religious right. They'll point out some that, like the Southern Baptist Convention was not united against abortion when Roe v. Wade came out. Other people will say there's a long-standing problem with abortion among conservative Christians. But what I think is clear is that by the late 1970s, religious conservatives, aided in no small part by a book and video series called Whatever Happened to the Human Race by a man named Francis Schaeffer, and then C. Everett Koop, who was Ronald Reagan's Surgeon General, had convinced a lot of white conservatives that abortion was the moral issue of their time. And it brought together for them a host of issues that we've seen going back to the Scopes trial. A, the problem of the strong federal government that's making rules that your state doesn't want, right? Roe v. Wade is a national decision. Your state doesn't have a choice in it, and this government can come in and enforce things that you don't want. It has to do with gender. Some historians argue that part of what happens with the religious right, and they argue about whether this was principled or cynical, is that particularly Southern people who were part of the religious right by the early 70s were saying, you know what, we were wrong about race. We were wrong about segregation. God does not order the world based on race. We were wrong about that. You know how God orders the world? Gender. Male and female, he created them. And you're all messing with gender. The boys have the long hair, the girls are wearing pantsuits. I'm not kidding about that, actually. Jerry Falwell in the 1970s had a list of 10 signs of the apocalypse. Women wearing pantsuits was on it. I have, however, seen some of the pantsuits you all wore in the 70s, and in terms of aesthetics, he was not wrong. This is the beginning of the rise of the LGBTQ movement. Like that messes with these ideas of gender. So there's this sense that what holds the country together are families. And families are based on a gender binary, and you're messing with the binary. And you know what the ultimate sign of that is? Mothers are killing their babies. That's what abortion is in this view. It is the ultimate sign of the falling apart of gender, and it's the ultimate sign of secular humanism. Because who would kill their child? Well, someone who doesn't believe in God and who thinks that their self-interest, as they would understand it, is the arbiter of what is good. So all of these issues come together and catalyze a movement that then begins to unite around one party, the party that's willing to say, you know what, your issues are our issues. Again, there's a lot of historical debate about how these issues are working together. So some people will say, really, it's abortion, right? People had a principled problem with abortion, and what brings the religious right into being is this principled problem with abortion. Other people say, no, you know what? Abortion was a way to get people into the religious right, but what really drove it was this concern about the federal government and taxes, and really people wanting to still be able to have segregated schools. Like that's what was really the driver, and abortion is just a cover. Other people will say, no, it was really school prayer and it was religious freedom. And then people will say, nope, your religious freedom is just a way of imposing your vision of the world on other. So you can see how this is all a debate. And the stakes in the debate, right? How you describe this has a lot of moral weight. But I think what's clear is that some set of these issues brought people together to unite around one party, which then gave them a lot of political power. Now, they may have had all of these beliefs before, but they were divided among the parties. Right? So there were white conservatives voting for Democrats and there were white conservatives voting for Republicans. Now they're all in one party, so we talk about them as a political bloc. I want to note that it is 11:30. I could say a lot more, but I think I will stop there. So you all can go. But I am happy to stay and take questions if you have any. But I guess the final thing I'll say is for those of you who are like, what's happened to the main line? What happened to the main line? The little bit I'll say there is that the main line has remained more politically divided, right? Which means that it hasn't served as the same kind of voting bloc when we talk about American politics. Mainline leadership has gone much more progressive, but not necessarily the people in the pews, right? So when we think about how religious people shape politics, there's a very clear kind of role for white religious and political conservatives. There's a very clear place for African Americans now, right, in terms of where they vote. The white mainline doesn't have quite the same political identity, which means that its influence has been, depending on how you want to think about it, but let's say more diffuse, because it's not just one thing. All right. I'm happy to take questions. I'm also not offended if you've been sitting for a long time and you want to leave. Questions? That was a lot. Yeah.
I had a political science professor who said that where the parties stand on issues changes every 40 years.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of general.
Mm-hmm.
It's,
Right. I mean, I think that's certainly true. I mean, we get into a lot of fights today where people are like, well, the Democrats were the party of, slavery and the Republicans were the party of freedom. And it's like, yeah, what those parties were in 1860 actually doesn't matter today. Right? In the 1960s, there were Republicans who were liberal on abortion. And there were Democrats who were conservative, particularly, right? Catholics have tended to be part of the Democratic coalition that's been shifting related to all of this. But there's a long history of very pro-life Democrats that has basically ended. But those parties have shifted around those issues. They shifted around the civil rights issues, right? They've shifted a lot. So yeah, the parties shift and the alignment shift. Absolutely. So 40 years, 50 years, but absolutely shifts. Yeah. Yeah.
I read
Uh-huh.
years ago somewhere,
Uh-huh.
I couldn't even tell you the publication, but you mentioned it with 1960s, but did not Nixon actually like Martin Luther King and was rather friendly with him and asked Ike, hey, can I help get him out of jail? And Ike said no. And then RFK told JFK, hey man, you need to let him go.
Right.
And that's another reason for the swing.
That's, I don't know that story about Nixon and Ike, but I do know that Republicans had a more complex relationship with the civil rights movement than, say, like Barry Goldwater did, right? And it wasn't necessarily the case that all Democrats were on board with the civil rights movement. I mean, I think it's fair to say that, JFK, that probably was not the forefront of his mind as when he was president. And even LBJ, right, has a he has a very complicated relationship. And he and Martin Luther King actually worked together very well and then had a major split over Vietnam. When King came out against Vietnam, King knowingly cut his relationship off with LBJ. That was clear that was going to happen. So yes, all of that's complicated, but yeah, that is part of the swing, right? That those changes in the parties as they redefine themselves around civil rights issues, particularly around states' rights. Yeah, Mark.
Sarah, thanks for your presentation. Great, clear, and really informative in terms of the current landscape. How would you another mix put into the mix here? What about the rural-urban thing?
Yeah.
How does that sort of factor in? If you could just give a thumbnail sketch.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of pieces of that. Part of it has, I think, to do with more homogenous and less homogenous communities. So I think that's part of that story. I think rural areas, for lots of historical reasons, tend to be more conservatively religious in not necessarily church-going ways, but in identification ways. So I think that's part of it. I think there is, in at least parts of rural America too, how do I want to say this? A kind of, that have held on to that sense of the not maybe self-made, but community-made American that for lots of reasons in cities is simply a harder, not that people can't hold on to it in cities, but the roles of the government, I think, in cities can be a lot more visible. And in rural areas, they're there. So I come from a stock of people who were farmers in South Dakota who were all basically libertarians, but happily took their government checks for not planting, right? but didn't understand that as a government program they were benefiting from, right? That was what was owed to them for like their service to the country. Right, so I think that there's a whole bunch of things going on there. And then I think education divides also get hard. I mean, I do think one of the things I sometimes think about with people on the more kind of progressive religious side and political side is that, I guess I'll out myself here, we do a better job of deconstructing than we do of giving some kind of coherent vision towards which people can live their lives. And I'll say, as someone who feels pretty comfortable economically, it's one thing to deconstruct when you've got like time and leisure and like all these other things. When you don't, like, I can see for some people this notion like, you are deconstructing my community and the things that I've been told that are good, and I'm living kind of close to the edge anyways, and I want somebody to tell me that I'm okay. And you're not going to do that, and I will find someone who will. So I think that can play too. And again, ways that are complicated, but I think are also happening. And I'm not sure what to do about that. But I think that can play. I don't know. Do you have any? I would take your answer too. Other questions?
Was he talking just about Minnesota? Because anybody on the East Coast and the West Coast, all of Minnesota's rural.
Right. Yeah.
We're not considered people here.
Right. Yeah. No. I think there are people who do think like that. Yes.
Oh, a lot
Yeah.
of people.
Right. Although I will say, when I was in North Carolina, I was from Washington State. I did have someone ask me, no joke, if we still lived in log cabins. I was like, no, you've heard of Microsoft, right? Like, that's where I live. Yeah.
Do you see students on both sides of this divide at West Davis?
Yes, I do. I think the more vocal side tends to be left, the left side. But we certainly have students who are more on the right, who I think tend to express themselves in writing and things like that. But I think rightly or wrongly feel themselves to be not just a minority, but a silenced minority. And I think that is educationally complicated. And we do struggle with that. But yeah, you absolutely see students on both sides of things. And the role of religion here is not, I mean, in a way that wasn't true when I came to Gustavus in 2007. I regularly get students here now who just don't know anything about religion. Like, nothing. Right? I mean, when I teach religion now, I hold up a Bible and I say, this is a Bible in a Protestant Bible, and then I will explain what that means. It has two parts.
Very academic.
Right, it's very academic, but it's also like just talking to people who don't really know about that. But my point there is a couple of things, which is that I think one of the things that we're going to have to think about as a country is, what do you do when you have people on both sides for whom politics becomes religion? Like, when politics becomes the thing that gives your life ultimate meaning, what does that mean? Right? And I think we're seeing it on both sides, because even sometimes the conservative students, going back to this rural thing, they will be religious, but they're not churched. Right? They identify as religious people, but religious in the sense of like being religious, like faith. You have to have faith to be a good person. What is the content of that faith? That's not as important, right? So I think that's something we're beginning to see too, where politics is becoming to have kind of ultimate meaning, which I will say as a religious person, but also as a historian, doesn't make me wildly excited. I mean, people have killed in the name of religion. They've also killed in the name of politics. Like getting people to be less religious, I don't think helps that situation. Getting them to be less violent does. Yeah.
What do you think of, there was I believe a progressive church that just came out against, Herschel Walker.
Oh.
And, but there's a lot, that seems to be a more common theme now is that
Right.
certain churches are becoming
Right.
Politically outspoken.
Right. Yeah. So I think one of the things that's happened around some of that, I'm not sure I know exactly that specific case, but that I think one of the dynamics in Georgia right now is that, and this happened in 2020 as well, that there's this positioning of Senator Warnock as not religious, which is interesting as he is actually a Baptist pastor. But part of what's at stake there is people making the implicit claim, I think two implicit claims. One, that liberal religion isn't really religion, right? And that two, particularly Black liberal religion is not religion, right? It's a claim about whether or not that Warnock isn't really a pastor, he's just a politician, and that Black churches aren't really churches, they're just places of politics. And so there's a way in which then I think other Black ministers are having to come up and say like, no, the Black church is a church that tends to talk a lot about politics, not because they want to be partisan necessarily, but because politics have so profoundly affected the lives of their people, they have to. And just historically, Black churches have been one of the safe places, to the extent that any of them were safe, for Black people to talk about politics, right? So I think part of that then is also related to some complicated relationships there. It's hard, but I will say this is one of those moments that when we start talking about churches endorsing politicians, I will say that when Southern Baptists do that to Donald Trump, it tends to make me very uncomfortable, right? So then there's a question of consistent application. What's my principle there? Is it that I don't want churches endorsing candidates, or is it that I don't want churches endorsing candidates I don't like? Right? And I think those are kind of questions to wrestle with. So that was not really an answer so much as I think that's an ongoing conversation, but that is deeply rooted in different histories. Yeah.
I guess maybe you've answered my question, but I'm wondering why the religious right, conservative religious right, doesn't demand more morality out of their leadership. Because I'm thinking of a morally bankrupt former president who, on many counts, is it just the expediency of getting conservative judges to overthrow Roe versus Wade, so they're looking at the ultimate expediency of supporting this person? Or why don't they expect more of him? He can't even hold a Bible right side up.
So this is a real book recommendation. If you haven't read the book Jesus and John Wayne by Kristen Dumais, who's a historian from Calvin University, you should. But I'm just going to crib her argument because I think she's right, is that within this conservative branch of Christianity, there has actually been a long-standing valorization of a type of manhood that is swaggering and protects women and children. And you forgive the swaggering and the immorality if they're doing the manly thing and protecting the right stuff. And so she goes back to John Wayne, who was not a saint, right, in his own personal morality, but was seen as a good conservative because he fought the bad guys, right? And then you can go, she kind of keeps tracing this. Oliver North, right? Valorized, did he break the law? Well, yeah, but for the right reasons. Right? And so her argument is that Trump and that kind of brand is not as much of a departure for the religious right as people in the religious right sometimes want to say that there is a through line, not for everybody who's a conservative, but that there is a through line on what men are allowed to do in the protection of this vision of America. It is a good book. It's maybe not the funnest, depending on your politics, not something that's going to make you feel good, but it's a very interesting argument.
Yeah, I think also in your backdrop, going back into the 60s
Uh-huh.
and 70s, you got to look at, Marx and Engels and Stalin, when they're saying, God is dead, religion's the opiate of the people.
Right.
This is a reaction a lot of that, and then Stalin comes along and starts chomping at everybody. People were scared to death.
Absolutely. And here's where there's a certain type of conservative to whom I am not at all unsympathetic. The Soviet Union was not a warm, fuzzy place, right? It's not clear, and I think this is kind of one of the conservative claims, is that you take God out of the picture, things get better. Right? This sort of sense that some, particularly, but not only conservatives have, that believing in an ultimate reality, right, who actually establishes what is good, can have some salutary effects, right? That we may not actually want to live in Stalin's world or Nietzsche's world. Like, God being dead may not be a good thing, because then the rules really could be whoever has the most power wins. Right? Now, to go to your question, the response is, well, what we have now are people who think that God has given them the power to do whatever the heck they want, and that's not any better. Right? But yeah, I think you're right. And when people looked at the play out of people who were, again, Marx, Stalin, and those folks, they didn't see it going well. And they weren't crazy to see it that way. Their answer may not be perfect, but they were not making Siberia up, right? It was real.
And it still is.
And still is, yeah.
Thank you.
All right, well, that was depressing. Vote on Tuesday.